The world remembers the war in ruins, the headlines of victory, the flags raised over shattered capitals. But beneath those familiar images lies a silence far older. A silence that clings like smoke to sealed archives and unmarked graves. Whispers of convoys that carried no names, of vaults locked behind steel, of files that were signed, stamped, and then erased. It is a history carved not into monuments, but into shadows. Fragments of evidence scattered across seas, deserts, and burned-out ministries. What lingers are stories too dangerous to admit. Moments stitched together by rumor. Fragments of testimony from those who saw too much and lived long enough to regret remembering. Behind every official order, behind every page of victory, there is another story buried. Guarded not by soldiers, but by silence itself. And silence, once broken, does not fade. It echoes, demanding to be heard, even when the world tries to forget. Chapter 1. The Vanished Files of Operation Eclipse. In the final chaotic weeks of the Second World War, as Berlin collapsed under the weight of Soviet artillery and the Reich's ministries lay in ruins, a quiet and far more deliberate mission was unfolding in the shadows. It was called Operation Eclipse, officially a plan drafted by the Allies to oversee the military occupation of Germany once Hitler's forces were defeated. Yet beneath the surface of its bureaucratic wording, documents and testimonies hint at a darker, more secretive component that never appeared in public communique. In April 1945, while the Wehrmacht's last defenders prepared futile barricades in the streets, convoys of trucks left Berlin under armed escort, not filled with civilians or retreating soldiers, but with crates and safes sealed with wax insignias. Their contents, according to fragmentary manifests, were classified administrative property of the Reich. What exactly those shipments contained would be the subject of decades of speculation, vanishing into layers of redacted reports and missing files. Surviving Allied officers who were present at Tempelhof Airport and the Reich Chancellery recall glimpses of the convoys. Colonel James Morton of the US Army's Counterintelligence Corps described in a post-war interview how a column of 6 grey-painted trucks bearing Wehrmacht markings, but escorted by units with no identifiable insignia, departed the Ministry of Armaments compound on 23rd of April 1945, heading westward under cover of night. Morton noted that these soldiers carried American-made Thompson submachine guns rather than standard-issue German weaponry. When he filed a memorandum on the sighting, the report disappeared from the archives, and Morton's military file later contained no record of his posting in Berlin. He would insist until his death in 1963 that the convoy was not German nor Soviet, but something else entirely. British sources corroborate fragments of this story. Declassified MI6 cables from May 1945 reference priority seizures of intelligence materials in the British sector, specifically mentioning economic files and weapons research. Among them was a directive titled Special Handling Directive 12, which ordered field officers to secure documents relating to German negotiations with neutral countries and all papers concerning experimental weapons projects. These documents were to be delivered to a secure repository under the codename Vault E. Yet curiously, post-war records of Vault E holdings are absent, and when British historian Hugh Trevor Roper requested access in 1954, the Foreign Office replied that the materials had been transferred to American custody. When approached in Washington, the US National Archives responded that no such transfer was recorded. By the early 1950s, fragments of the missing material began to surface in unexpected places. A classified CIA assessment dated 1952, now partially declassified, references acquired German files regarding the placement of intelligence assets within Allied command structures. April 1945. One paragraph hints that these files contain proof of high-level collaboration between German industrialists and Allied financial institutions stretching back before the outbreak of war. The names are redacted, but the report concluded that disclosure would destabilize the foundation of Western cooperation in the Cold War. This sentence alone has fueled decades of suspicion that Operation Eclipse's true objective was not reconstruction planning as the public was told, but the removal of incriminating documents that could undermine post-war alliances. Further evidence lies in Soviet complaints at the Potsdam Conference in July 1945. Records of Molotov's exchanges with American officials show repeated accusations that the US was withholding captured documents of mutual interest, specifically concerning German atomic research. While the Americans dismissed this as propaganda, Soviet intelligence files released in the 1990s confirmed that NKVD officers observed Allied convoys removing crates from the ruins of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Dahlem in late April. These crates never appeared in the official Allied scientific collection program. The Soviets concluded that their Western counterparts were concealing the true scale of German progress in nuclear and chemical weapons research, possibly to integrate the findings into their own secret programs. The mystery deepened when, in 1967, a former officer of the French 12e Bureau named Henri Clément gave an interview to Le Monde. He claimed that during his deployment in occupied Germany, he had been tasked with escorting 2 sealed crates from a depot near Kassel to an American airbase at Wiesbaden in June 1945. He was instructed never to record the transfer in his logbook. Clément stated that he briefly glimpsed one of the seals broken. Inside was not paperwork, but reels of film, each marked with Reichsadler stamps and labeled with scientific notations. He believed the footage depicted weapons testing, though he never saw it again. Shortly after the interview, Clément was found dead in his Paris apartment under suspicious circumstances. Officially, the cause was suicide. Modern researchers attempting to reconstruct Operation Eclipse's shadow history face a wall of redactions. In 1998, the US government released thousands of pages under the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act. Among them were references to Eclipse, sub-operations dealing with the seizure of industrial assets and intelligence archives. Yet entire sections remain classified, marked as ongoing national security concern. Historians such as Richard Brightman have noted that it is unusual for World War II era material to remain restricted after half a century, unless the files contain information damaging to contemporary institutions or individuals still in positions of influence. The lingering question is what was so dangerous in those vanished files. Some point to evidence of secret negotiations between Nazi officials and Allied representatives seeking a separate peace in the West, which, if proven, would confirm long-denied accusations of betrayal toward the Soviet Union. Others argue that the documents contained evidence of industrial complicity in war crimes, implicating corporations that went on to form the backbone of Western economies in the Cold War era. Still others suggest the files held the truth about Nazi research into weapons far ahead of their time, research that quietly migrated into American defense projects under Operation Paperclip. Whatever the truth, Operation Eclipse continues to haunt the historical record. In the barren ruins of Berlin, amid the chaos of surrender, a different war was being waged, not with tanks and artillery, but with convoys of sealed crates, forged signatures, and erased records. Those who tried to follow the trail found their careers cut short, their testimonies buried, or their files destroyed. The war may have ended in May 1945, but in the shadows of Operation Eclipse, a new conflict had already begun. One fought not on battlefields, but in archives, vaults, and the quiet corridors of power, where silence and secrecy were the most lethal weapons of all. Chapter 2: The Ghost Convoys of Murmansk Route. In the winter of 1942, the Arctic convoys became one of the most perilous lifelines of the war. From Scotland and Iceland, merchant ships escorted by British, Canadian, and later American warships carried weapons, fuel, and raw materials to the Soviet port of Murmansk. The Germans threw everything they had against them: Luftwaffe dive bombers, U-boat wolf packs, and surface raiders lurking in the Norwegian fjords. Convoy PQ-17 remains infamous for its near-total destruction. Yet within the endless columns of shipping manifests and after-action reports, there are signs of something stranger. Certain ships are listed without cargo details, labeled only as Special Consignment X. And despite their civilian hulls, they were assigned destroyer escorts and strict blackout protocols. To this day, no surviving logbooks provide a clear account of what those shipments contained. The first reference to these shadow convoys appears in a Royal Navy memorandum dated 9 January 1942, filed under Admiralty Operations Division. It lists 28 vessels assigned to PQ-8, with cargo ranging from tanks to aviation fuel. At the bottom of the manifest, 2 ships are marked with the symbol XEX, their cargo columns left blank. The note beside them reads, "Escort required, no deviation permitted. Immediate transfer to NKVD supervision upon arrival." Naval historian David Irving later pointed out that this memorandum contained an unusual addendum in red pencil. All information restricted to Level 5. Distribution forbidden outside Admiralty. Only the first Sea Lord and 2 other officers had access to Level 5 clearances. The secrecy surrounding those 2 ships was greater than that of convoys carrying gold bullion. Survivors of the convoys provide fragmentary testimony. Chief Petty Officer Harold Blake, who served aboard the destroyer HMS Onslow, recalled in a 1961 interview with the Imperial War Museum that one night his vessel was ordered to shift position, screening 2 freighters marked with tarpaulin-covered structures on their decks. Blake remembered that even the crew were forbidden from looking toward the freighters. Armed guards stood at every access point, and when Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft appeared overhead, the freighters cut their running lights entirely, vanishing into the fog. After the convoy reached Murmansk, the freighters were immediately boarded by NKVD troops, wearing long leather coats and armed with PPSH-41 submachine guns. No Soviet dock workers were allowed near the unloading sites. Blake never saw the freighters again, and when he later tried to check their names in convoy records, the Admiralty files listed them as lost at sea. German intelligence files also suggest that something unusual was moving through the Arctic. Intercepted Enigma traffic decoded at Bletchley Park in March 1942 included a report from Admiral Raeder to Hitler stating, certain Anglo-American shipments to Murmansk suspected to contain apparatus of scientific and chemical importance. Efforts to intercept to be given highest priority. The decrypted message, preserved in HW 5312 at the UK National Archives, includes a curious annotation by a British analyst, refers possibly to radar or other experimental technology. Yet the annotation itself is redacted in subsequent released copies, leading researchers to suspect that even Bletchley Park's analysts were kept in the dark about the full significance of the intercept. The fate of several Special Consignment X ships remains mysterious. Convoy PQ-18, which sailed in September 1942, lost 13 ships to U-boats and aircraft. Among the missing were 2 freighters listed only by code names, Harrier and Falcon. No distress calls were ever received, though German reports of sinkings did not match the coordinates where the ships disappeared. Some survivors later whispered that these freighters carried sealed canisters marked with chemical hazard symbols. An unverified Soviet veteran's testimony, published in a 1991 Russian journal, described unloading long cylindrical containers that burned the skin if touched. If true, the cargo may have been related to chemical warfare research, though both London and Moscow vehemently denied deploying such materials. The secrecy continued even after the war. In 1946, the US Strategic Air Command requested access to Soviet reports on the Arctic convoys, hoping to study German attack patterns. The NKVD provided files, but entire sections referencing Special Consignment X were missing. American intelligence officers grew suspicious, and a classified State Department memo dated 1947 speculated that Anglo-American transfers of scientific materials may have exceeded Yalta agreements. Historians today believe that these shipments may have included early microwave radar components, jet engine prototypes, or even uranium oxide for nuclear experiments. The Soviets, desperate to accelerate their atomic program, may have demanded such technology as the price of maintaining their war effort. Yet the most chilling element is the consistent disappearance of crew lists. In Admiralty archives, many convoys preserve detailed records of sailors and officers, but the names of crewmen aboard the XX freighters are absent. In some cases, the ships themselves were later erased from convoy tables, replaced with blank lines. Attempts by families to trace missing sailors were met with vague replies stating that records were lost in action. Researchers now believe these omissions were deliberate, designed to conceal the identities of men who may have been sworn to silence after witnessing forbidden cargoes. A handful of sailors who spoke too freely were reportedly reassigned to dangerous postings in the Pacific, where their chances of survival were slim. The question remains, what was so valuable, so secret, that entire ships could vanish from the historical record? One clue lies in the Soviet archives opened briefly in the early 1990s before being closed again. A single line in an NKVD transport logbook, dated 5th of March 1942, reads, "Received special cargo, Convoy PQ-12, immediate transfer to Facility 713. Facility 713 was later identified as a closed research site near Sverdlovsk, associated with early Soviet nuclear and chemical weapons testing. The connection is circumstantial, but it aligns too closely with Western suspicions to be dismissed. Today, the Arctic seas remain graveyards of steel, with dozens of wrecks lying silent beneath the ice. Divers exploring sunken convoy ships occasionally find sealed compartments still untouched, their contents corroded but unrecognizable. None have conclusively been linked to the Special Consignment X shipments. The truth lies buried under ice, locked in sealed archives and erased from official memory. What began as a lifeline of survival for the Soviet Union may also have been a hidden corridor for technology, weapons, and secrets that shaped the Cold War. And for every name missing from the crew rosters, for every ship marked only with an XX, there is a ghost story whispered in the silence of the Murmansk route. A story of convoys that officially never existed, carrying cargo the world was never meant to see. Chapter 3. The Black Vaults of Peenemünde. On the windswept coast of Usedom, where the Baltic Sea crashes against the dunes, the German army's Heeresversuchsanstalt, Peenemünde, once stood as the nerve center of the Reich's most advanced weapons program. From 1937 until its destruction in 1945, it was here that Wernher von Braun and his team developed the V2 rocket, the first ballistic missile capable of striking at London from the skies. Yet the story of Peenemünde is not limited to the well-documented missile program. Hidden beneath the surface, literally carved into the sand dunes and concrete bunkers, were vaults where prototypes, films, and classified research were stored. When Soviet and Allied forces converged on the facility in April 1945, those vaults became the focus of a frantic, unacknowledged race. In the fog of collapsing Germany, much of what was taken from Peenemünde disappeared into secrecy, shaping the Cold War, but never reappearing in official archives. Official histories record that the British bombed Peenemünde in August 1943 during Operation Hydra, an effort to disrupt the V2 program. The raid devastated housing for forced laborers, but left many underground facilities intact. By 1945, those underground structures were reinforced with steel doors and camouflaged entrances. Allied intelligence documents later hinted that beneath the launch pads were chambers designated Vault A through Vault G, storing everything from prototype gyroscopic systems to film reels of test launches. A report by the US Army Ordnance Corps, dated 20th of June 1945, refers to Vault B materials seized under unknown circumstances by third-party units. The report includes a marginal note, possibly removed before official occupation. Who these third-party units were has never been clarified. Eyewitness accounts suggest that not all the vaults were captured by regular US or Soviet forces. German technicians who surrendered described unmarked groups arriving days before the Red Army took control. Dr. Helmut Grutrup, an engineer later conscripted to work in the Soviet missile program, recalled hearing rumors of men in plain uniforms speaking fluent German but carrying American weapons. According to his 1947 interrogation file, these men emptied certain storage rooms and loaded trucks before withdrawing westward. Grotrup's testimony was dismissed by Soviet officers as fabrication, but his account aligns with Colonel Robert Staver's US Army reports on missing documents. Staver, one of the architects of Operation Paperclip, noted in July 1945 that significant gaps exist in the recovered Peenemünde archives. Film rolls referenced by German technicians cannot be located. The Soviets, too, complained of missing material. NKVD officer Ivan Serov submitted a memorandum to Beria in September 1945, claiming that Western allies removed advanced materials from Peenemünde before Red Army forces secured the area. Serov specifically mentioned sealed metal canisters that witnesses claimed contained chemical agents designed for rocket payloads. The Soviets never located these canisters, though post-war reports from East German civilians describe columns of vehicles moving west through Mecklenburg, carrying sealed cargo escorted by soldiers without insignia. If true, this would suggest that the most dangerous research left Peenemünde long before the official Allied occupation. The British archives contain their own anomalies. In 1952, a declassified Air Ministry file labelled Avia 65-123 contained photographs of underground chambers at Peenemünde. The images show stacked crates labelled with serial codes beginning XG22. Yet no surviving German inventory lists items with that designation. A handwritten annotation in the file reads, "Photographs withdrawn 1947, retained for internal study." When researchers requested access to the full set of images in 1999, they were informed that the remainder had been transferred to Ministry of Defense holdings, not for public release. What the photographs depicted has never been explained. One particularly disturbing lead emerged in the 1960s, when a German filmmaker claimed to have obtained a fragment of celluloid from a destroyed vault at Peenemünde. The film allegedly showed test firings of rockets fitted with dispersal canisters. Eyewitnesses who viewed the strip described plumes of vapor and test animals tethered near the impact zone. Within weeks of announcing his find, the filmmaker's studio was burglarized, the film stolen, and the man himself died in a suspicious car crash. Official police reports listed it as an accident, but colleagues insisted he had been followed in the days prior. No trace of the film has ever surfaced. Historians attempting to reconstruct Peenemünde's missing archives have run into systematic obstacles. US Army intelligence files released under FOIA contain repeated references to classified Project 63B tied to Peenemünde, but the details are blacked out. Soviet files released briefly in the 1990s before being reclassified mention Vault G, unopened, presumed destroyed, though no photographs or corroborating evidence exist. Even the testimonies of surviving engineers are inconsistent. Some claimed only routine technical notes were stored in the underground rooms, while others insisted that the vaults contained designs for rocket payloads unsuitable for ordinary warfare. The ambiguity may be deliberate, seeded into the historical record to obscure the truth. What is known is that many of Peenemunde's scientists were quickly absorbed into both American and Soviet programs. Von Braun's team became central to NASA, while Grötrup and others were forced to assist the Soviet R-1 missile project. Yet even these programs show curious gaps. Technical drawings of the earliest US Redstone missile reference German prototype configurations that have never been found in the surviving paperclip files. Soviet rocket engineers likewise complained of incomplete documentation, suggesting that critical pieces were withheld from both sides. This raises the possibility that a third group, perhaps operating with Allied sanction but outside official military channels, secured the most sensitive material for private or covert use. By the late Cold War, whispers of Peenemunde's missing vaults persisted in intelligence circles. In 1981, West German intelligence assessment noted rumors of Western possession of undisclosed Peenemünde film archives. The same year, the US Department of Defense abruptly cancelled the planned release of several paperclip-related files, citing foreign policy concerns. Such decisions suggest that whatever was removed from those vaults still carried implications decades later, long after the rockets of Peenemünde had given way to intercontinental missiles and space shuttles. The legacy of Peenemünde is often told as a triumph of science over war, the birthplace of modern space exploration. But beneath the sanitized narratives lies a darker reality. Vaults sealed with steel doors, crates loaded onto trucks in the chaos of collapse, files vanishing into classified repositories. The story of the Black Vaults of Peenemünde is less about rockets than about silence. The silence of missing records, erased films, and the unmarked graves of forced laborers who built the weapons. What was stored in those vaults remains unanswered, yet its shadow lingers in the Cold War's secret programs and in the knowledge that history, like the Baltic coast itself, conceals more beneath its surface than it ever reveals. Chapter 4. The Silent Massacres of Operation Keelhaul. The spring of 1945 was a moment the world remembers for the end of war in Europe, but hidden within the official triumphal narrative was a policy carried out in silence, one that condemned tens of thousands to death and imprisonment. Operation Keelhaul, a term coined later by soldiers who could not forget what they had seen, referred to the forced repatriation of Soviet citizens, prisoners of war, refugees and émigrés who had fallen into Allied hands. While the Yalta Agreement gave diplomatic cover for these transfers, the reality on the ground was far darker than the carefully worded communiqué suggested. Entire families were rounded up. Soldiers who had fought against Stalin, as much as against Hitler, were handed over in cattle cars, and those who resisted were delivered at gunpoint to NKVD units waiting at the borders. The massacres that followed were never recorded in official Allied histories, yet the evidence lies buried in memoranda, eyewitness testimonies, and the silence of archives that remain sealed. In May 1945, camps across Italy, Austria, and Germany became collection points for so-called repatriates. One of the most infamous incidents occurred in the Drau Valley of Austria, where British troops under the command of Brigadier Toby Lowe, later Lord Aldington, oversaw the handover of thousands of Cossacks, many of whom had never been Soviet citizens to begin with. Declassified War Office records show that lists of prisoners were compiled hastily, with little attempt to distinguish between combatants and civilians. On 28 May 1945, British lorries ferried prisoners under guard to the town of Lienz, where NKVD officers awaited. Survivors later described scenes of chaos as men, women, and children realized they were not being resettled, but delivered to Stalin's police. Some threw themselves into rivers. Others slashed their own throats with concealed knives. British soldiers, ordered to maintain discipline, reportedly used rifle butts to drive the prisoners forward. In official reports, the incident is described only as transfer completed without major incident. American forces were also complicit. In Bavaria, units of the US 45th Infantry Division were ordered to load train cars with Russian Liberation Army soldiers, commanded by General Andrei Vlasov. The men had fought under German command but hoped to seek asylum in the West. Instead, under directives from SHAF headquarters, they were bound and gagged, then loaded into sealed cars bound for the Soviet zone. A report filed by Lieutenant Colonel John H. Patterson, now preserved in the US Army's European Theater archives, describes emotional disturbance among troops who objected to the handovers. Patterson wrote, "It is my belief that many of these men will face execution or labor camps. I register my formal protest against further participation." His protest was ignored, and weeks later, Patterson's transfer orders reassigned him to a logistics posting in France. His file notes no further involvement in repatriation operations. Soviet archives provide grim confirmation of what awaited the returnees. Documents declassified in the 1990s from the State Archive of the Russian Federation include execution orders signed by NKVD General Ivan Serov. One such order, dated 12th of June 1945, authorizes special measures for 3,256 individuals returned at the Graz handover site. Of those, 1,437 were executed within days, the rest dispatched to labor camps in Vorkuta and Norilsk. The language of the order is bureaucratic, referring to contingents rather than human beings. But the reality is unmistakable. For many, Operation Keelhaul was not repatriation, but a death sentence. The British government worked carefully to conceal its role. Foreign Office memoranda show deliberate efforts to downplay reports reaching Parliament. A 1947 internal memo from FO official Sir Yvonne Kirkpatrick states bluntly, "The less that is said of Keelhaul, the better. Disclosure would compromise our moral standing and complicate relations with the Soviets." This policy of silence extended to censorship. Letters from soldiers describing what they had seen were intercepted. Journalists attempting to investigate were discouraged. When General Alexander's staff prepared a report for internal circulation, entire pages describing suicides and shootings were removed before the document was filed. The sanitized version made no mention of bloodshed. Some of the darkest details come from eyewitness accounts preserved privately. Captain Alan Brock, a British officer in Klagenfurt, kept a diary describing how prisoners were told they were being relocated to camps in Italy. He wrote on 29 May 1945, "I saw women clasping infants, men kissing the ground, all pleading with us not to send them east. Some tried to cling to our boots. The Russians waiting for them made no attempt to hide their intent. We all knew it was a death march, and yet we carried out the order." Brock's diary remained hidden until his death in 1983, when his family donated it to a university archive. Portions of it were later published, sparking renewed controversy about Allied complicity. The Americans attempted to frame the policy as a necessary evil of alliance politics. In a 1952 congressional inquiry into displaced persons, Assistant Secretary of State George Kennan was questioned about forced repatriations. His testimony was evasive. Agreements reached at Yalta required us to act in accordance with commitments made to our allies. It was never our wish to endanger individuals, but circumstances of war imposed difficult necessities. The inquiry never pressed further, and the topic faded into obscurity during the Cold War, overshadowed by new tensions with the Soviet Union. For the victims of Keelhaul, silence was absolute. Their names vanished into Soviet penal lists, their graves unmarked in frozen camps. The moral compromise of Operation Keelhaul remains one of the least discussed chapters of the war's aftermath. While the Nuremberg trials proclaimed justice for crimes against humanity, The Allies themselves quietly handed thousands into the hands of an ally known for mass repression. The irony was not lost on soldiers who witnessed it. In letters smuggled home, one British sergeant wrote, "We defeated Hitler only to hand his enemies to Stalin. What then have we accomplished?" His words were censored, but they echo the unease of those who saw the truth firsthand. Even decades later, declassification has been piecemeal, with key files withheld under the Official Secrets Act and American archives citing national security concerns. The survivors who made it through the gulags told their stories in whispers, often dismissed as exaggerations. Yet enough evidence exists, diaries, orders, transport manifests, to establish the reality. The massacres may not appear in official histories, but they remain etched in the memory of those who were there and in the silence of families who never saw their loved ones again. Operation Keelhaul stands as a reminder that even in victory, justice was compromised by politics, that the line between liberator and accomplice was blurred in the fog of post-war realignment. In the summer of 1945, amid celebrations of peace, train whistles echoed across Europe carrying thousands, not to freedom, but to execution grounds and frozen mines. These were the silent massacres, carried out under Allied orders, buried under decades of official denial, and remembered only in fragments of testimony that refused to be erased. Chapter 5. The Disappearance of U-Boat Squadron, Werewolf. In the final weeks of the war, as Admiral Karl Dönitz assumed command of the crumbling Third Reich after Hitler's suicide, orders went out to Germany's submarine fleet to surrender to Allied forces. Hundreds of U-boats complied, surfacing under white flags at Allied ports from Norway to Scotland. Yet among these surrendering vessels, a small squadron known by the codename Werewolf never answered the signal. Records suggest they sailed from Kiel in early May 1945, refueling briefly at Kristiansand, Norway, before vanishing into the North Atlantic. Their disappearance was not merely a footnote in chaos. The fate of Werewolf Squadron has remained one of the most enduring mysteries of the war, whispered about in naval intelligence circles and Cold War espionage files for decades after the guns fell silent. British Admiralty records confirm at least 3 submarines were part of the Werewolf group. Intercepted Enigma transmissions, decoded at Bletchley Park on 2nd May 1945, contain references to Cargo Transport Priority 1 and special orders not subject to standard capitulation. The decoded messages are catalogued in HW 18302, though large portions are redacted. What remains legible includes instructions to avoid contact with Allied patrols and to maintain radio silence until Directive Z. Analysts noted the unusual phrasing. Unlike any standard Kriegsmarine communication, it hinted at missions beyond ordinary naval warfare. Post-war testimonies from German sailors spoke of sealed containers loaded onto the submarines in Kiel, crates stamped with Reichsadler seals and guarded by SS officers rather than naval personnel. Their contents have never been revealed. The Allies, aware that several U-boats had slipped away, launched Operation Deadlight to hunt down stragglers. But search grids drawn over the North Atlantic found nothing resembling the Werewolf Squadron. The Royal Navy scuttled over 100 surrendered U-boats in late 1945, yet no vessels matching Werewolf's identifiers were among them. A US Navy intelligence memorandum dated 14th of August 1946 states, several submarines, believed to have departed from Kristiansand circa 4th May, remain unaccounted for. Rumors suggest possible escape to South America. Recommend continued monitoring of Argentinian ports. The memo was classified top secret and remained sealed until the 1990s. Speculation grew during the immediate post-war years, particularly as sightings accumulated. In July 1945, fishermen off the Canary Islands reported a surfaced submarine flying no flag, which vanished when approached by Spanish patrol boats. In 1947, the Buenos Aires newspaper, La Nación, published an article claiming 2 U-boats had surrendered secretly at the port of Mar del Plata, Argentina. The Argentine Navy confirmed the surrender of U-530 and U-977 that year, both late arrivals from Europe, yet rumors persisted that additional submarines had slipped into remote Patagonian coves under cover of night, never officially logged. These stories were fueled by intelligence intercepts, suggesting Nazi escape networks, known as rat lines, were funneling high-ranking officials and resources to South America. If Werewolf Squadron carried such cargo, It may have been destined for those hidden harbors. Theories about the contents of Werewolf's mysterious cargo multiplied. Some argued that it was treasure, looted gold, stolen artworks, or foreign currency reserves smuggled out to finance Nazi exile communities. Others suspected technology, jet engine prototypes, nuclear research notes, or chemical weapons experiments too dangerous to leave behind. A CIA memorandum from 1952, declassified in 2001, refers obliquely to technical consignments possibly transported by rogue U-boat elements. The memo concludes that confirmation was unlikely due to destruction of German naval archives. Yet the fact that US intelligence still tracked the possibility 7 years after the war underscores how seriously the matter was taken. Eyewitness accounts add unsettling details. A Norwegian dockworker named Jens Holmsen, deposed in 1946, testified that in late April 1945, he saw SS officers loading long cylindrical containers into U-boats at Kiel's naval dockyard. The containers required cranes and were marked with skull and crossbones hazard symbols. Holmsen swore under oath that he overheard one officer mention Amerikawaffen, weapons intended for America. Though his testimony was dismissed at the time as rumor, it resurfaced in the 1980s when investigative journalists re-examined Cold War files. By then, Holmsen had died, but his statement remained in the Norwegian National Archives. The Soviets too were convinced that something had slipped away. A 1948 NKVD report warned of remaining fascist naval units possibly en route to South America with technical documents of high value. The Soviets demanded answers from the British and Americans during early Cold War negotiations, but both denied knowledge of missing submarines. Whether this was ignorance or deliberate concealment remains unresolved. What is clear is that Soviet naval patrols extended aggressively into the South Atlantic in the late 1940s, suggesting they took the threat seriously enough to act. By the 1960s, the Werewolf story had entered the realm of rumor, but intelligence agencies never fully let it go. West German intelligence files released after reunification contain references to continued surveillance of possible werewolf survivors. One file, BND 72-440, describes reports of an unidentified submarine sighted near the Strait of Magellan in 1958, too large for the Chilean Navy and unmarked by any flag. Though inconclusive, the report demonstrates how the shadow of these vanished U-boats lingered for decades. The enduring mystery lies in the complete absence of wreckage. Hundreds of U-boats were sunk during the war, their hulks located on the seabed by sonar in later years. Yet no trace of the Werewolf vessels has ever been confirmed. Wreck divers exploring the Norwegian coast and the North Atlantic floor continue to find U-boats, but none match the hull numbers associated with the squadron. Either they lie in waters too deep to detect, or they reach destinations where their hulls were dismantled and concealed. The disappearance of U-boat Squadron Werewolf remains a story written in absence. Absent wrecks, absent records, absent answers. For historians, it highlights the grey zone between the official surrender of Nazi Germany and the survival instincts of its last adherents. In those weeks of collapse, as cities burned and millions starved, convoys of trucks carried away archives, scientists vanished into Allied custody, and submarines slipped out of their pens carrying sealed cargo. The Allies claimed victory, but shadows moved across the oceans, shadows that refused to surrender. The Werewolf Squadron may never be found, but its legend endures as a reminder that even in defeat, secrets can vanish beneath the waves, beyond the reach of history's light. What we glimpse in these hidden fragments is not a clean ending, not a world tidied by treaties and parades, but a world that traded one kind of darkness for another. The files that vanished did not dissolve. They sank into deeper vaults, waiting for those reckless enough to search. The wrecks left unfound, the maps smudged with missing lines, the orders written in disappearing ink. All remind us that history is not what was recorded, but what was concealed. Every unanswered question hangs like a locked door in the corridors of time, daring us to listen for the whispers behind it. Perhaps the war did not end. It only changed its disguise, slipping into silence, into secrecy, into the very stories no one dares to tell aloud. And if silence is the last weapon, then breaking it may be the most dangerous act of all.